Hey happy champers, Marnie from Bubble and Flute. Today I'm going to introduce you to 3 champagnes that I discovered when I was doing my road test of 15 champagnes under $50. Check that out on the blog. But today what we're here to talk about is these 3 champagnes and why I selected them as my standouts from my 15 champagnes under $50. So when I tasted all the champagne side by side, I put my hand on my heart and imagined I was doing a blind tasting and said to myself, if I was doing a blind tasting, would I, honest to God, pick this easily as being champagne? For these 3 wines right here, yep, without a doubt, I would have picked them as champagne straight up. Many of the other champagnes that I tasted, I probably couldn't say the same thing for. And I'm a champagne lover, and if something doesn't taste like champagne, meh, I don't quite understand why you drink it, because you might as well just have sparkling wine. So why? I guess the big question is why do I pick something as tasting like champagne or not? And to me, it comes down to 2 key factors. The first being related to the soil or the terroir. One of the key hallmarks of champagne is its terroir or the soil, and it's quite famous for having this chalky limestone substrate. And what that does is when the water comes up through the vines by the process of osmosis, it imparts those chalky limestone flavors into the champagne, and it should generally be pretty instantly detectable when you are drinking a champagne. Now, in the Champagne region, there's actually 5 different sub-districts, and each of those districts is probably well known for something in particular. So the first is the Montana de Reims, which is a mountainous region in the north, which is really, really well known for Pinot Noir grapes. Then you have the Valley de la Marne, which is a valley, and it's really well known for producing Pinot Meunier grapes. And Pinot Meunier is actually quite a sturdier grape variety than Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, and being a valley, that area is more susceptible to frost, so they plant the Pinot Meunier grapes there because it's more resistant to frost than the other grape varieties. Then the third main region would be the Côte Blanc, which is the king or the queen of Chardonnay, so all the beautiful, beautiful Chardonnay grapes are produced in that particular region. Right beside the Côte de Blanc is another region called the Côte de Sézanne, and it's separated from the Côte de Blanc by basically a marsh. So when you hop, skip and jump over the other side of the marsh, the soil does change somewhat. It's not quite so chalky, it's a little bit more marshy and dirty. And then finally, the 5th region is called the Aube or the Côte de Bar. And it's actually quite a controversial-ish region of Champagne in that it was only introduced to the Champagne appellation in the earliest 20th century, and a lot of fancy pants Champagne gurus debate that it should ever have been introduced, and the soil, the terroir, really isn't up to scratch to produce those characteristics of champagne. So when I'm tasting a wine and I'm not 100% getting a strong sense of champagniness from it, one of the first questions I'll ask is, where's it from? And my first inclination will be, if I'm not getting a really strong sense of that chalky limestoney that I love about champagne, I'm probably going to suspect it's from one of those latter 2 regions and not one of those top 3 regions. The second factor that I think is a really strong influencer to me, whether I'll instantly pick something as being champagne or not, is how long the champagne is left on lees. So the Champagne Committee requires any non-vintage champagne to be cellared for a minimum of 15 months. You'll find that a lot of the big houses and a lot of the really successful growers champagnes will cellar their wines for up to a minimum of 3 years, twice as much as that bare minimum. And they do that because it adds flavour. When the longer that the champagne is cellared, the greater the flavour and the more complexity. Because what happens during that time the champagne is cellared? So champagne goes through a first fermentation and basically turns it from being grape juice to booze. So that makes it alcoholic. So it's called alcoholic fermentation. Then it goes through a secondary fermentation in the cellars. And right before it hits the cellars, the winemakers add a combination of sugar and yeast into the champagne. And so what happens is when it first hits the cellars, the yeast cells consume the sugar, a chemical reaction occurs which produces carbon dioxide. So you have got champagne in a sealed bottle, the carbon dioxide has nowhere to go, so it sits in the wine and that's what produces the bubbles. And so you're left with bubbly, alcoholic wine with a bunch of yeast cells in there. And then what happens is the yeast cells go through a process called autolysis when they effectively eat themselves. Once the autolysis has occurred, the champagne, the yeast cells, then they call it sitting on lees, or the dead yeast cells are called lees. The champagne will sit on lees or in contact with those dead yeast cells for a minimum of 15 months, up to 3 years or 6 years, depending on how long the house chooses to leave their non-vintage wine in contact with the lees. And bizarrely enough, as unsexy as it sounds, those dead yeast cells impart flavour and complexity to the wine. And again, unsurprisingly, being yeast, what happens when bread rises? It's got to do with yeast, so that's why you get that smell of fresh bread. So that's the second factor for me. If I'm not getting that strong, beautiful, yeasty smell instantly or being able to taste it when I sip the wine, I'll be inclined to think, maybe this champagne has only been cellared for the minimum of 15 months. And it's not to say it's not as nice, but when you love that champagne flavour like I do, you're probably going to be less rapt about it because the flavour's not as strong. And so to my mind, it's not enjoyable. So that is how I selected these three as my standout, because to me, they categorically, hands down, tasted like champagne. And before I did my road test, I hadn't done any research on any of the champagnes, so I knew nothing about them. As it turns out, all of these three champagnes are indeed from one of the three key regions that I mentioned at the beginning. So here I have Chars or Barn, Blanc de Blanc in fact. So Blanc de Blanc is 100% Chardonnay. Blanc de Blanc meaning white wine made from white grapes, in contrast to a Blanc de Noir, which is white wine made from red grapes, when you have a champagne that is made purely from Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier grapes. The second, and this is from a village called Toissy. And the second champagne here is Mercier, and this is actually a really well-known house in France, and they have a beautiful big maison in Épinay, which is this stunning town, one of the two key towns in the Champagne region. So here we have 100% Chardonnay, and this is from the, I'm going to say, I'm not sure what Toissy is actually. This is predominantly a Pinot Noir champagne. And finally here on the end we have this big standout for me. This was a real surprise to me, and I've really loved this champagne. It's called Champagne Henri Laurent, and it is from the Vallée de la Marne, and it's an 85% Pinot Meunier champagne. Now, you will find most non-vintage brut champagnes either are predominantly Pinot Noir or predominantly Chardonnay, and the Pinot Meunier is included as a blending grape. It's becoming more common now, particularly for grower champagnes, to produce 100% Pinot Meunier champagnes, or champagnes that have a higher percentage of Pinot Meunier. Some labels that you would know that have really quite high percentages of Pinot Meunier are Moet and Chandon and Piper Heidsieck, and I find they have quite a distinct flavour as well. So, and they're probably not suited to my palate. I love Pinot Noir, so I really enjoy a high Pinot Noir champagne. So it's quite a standout to me to find that I enjoyed an 85% Pinot Meunier champagne as much as I did. So at the end of the day, they were my choices, and I found them to be really enjoyable wines. This baby I think I picked up on sale at first choice for 25 bucks. So it probably standardly is about $50 a bottle, but to me that was a real standout. And that's just a bit of information, I guess, to help you understand what makes champagne taste like champagne. And yeah, so now you can go out and practice your champagne tasting skills, and if you're at a party and you're drinking a sparkling wine, have a sniff to see if you can pick any of those characteristics. And got any questions, please drop me a line, pop them in the comments below, and whatever you're doing this afternoon, I hope you're doing it with a glass of champagne. Ciao for now.